Hey guys, Ruminating Reaper here. So, it's Halloween today. Happy Halloween. I hope you're all having a good one. Obviously, to mark the spookiest day of the whole year, I figured I'd get one last horror review in for you. And this is a pretty important one of that because I have just watched the Blair Witch Project, directed, written, and edited by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez. A proper independent production in all senses of the word. And of course, the story behind it is legendary. A student project cost something like $6,000, went on to be a huge box office success and a blueprint moment in the horror genre, spawning a whole wave of found footage horrors. But do the film's micro budget scares hold up over 25 years later? Well, let's find out. So the film sees three student filmmakers, Heather, Josh, and Mike, head out into the woods near the small town of Burkittsville in October of 1994. Their mission? To film a documentary about a local Burkittsville legend known as the Blair Witch. However, on their mission to uncover the truth behind this legend, the trio end up getting lost in the woods. The film tells their story through the camera footage behind the making of their documentary, which was recovered a year later. So obviously the horror genre has one simple rule: low investment, high success. It's something that Jason Blum has pretty resoundingly proven over the last number of years, but I don't think there's any more concrete proof of that than this. The smallest of micro-budget films. And honestly, considering the resources the filmmakers had to work with, the end result is honestly a pretty damn admirable cinematic achievement. So obviously the whole central hook of it all, the story of these three misguided student filmmakers making a documentary in the woods, telling the story entirely through their camera footage, is a very, very interesting one. Obviously the story behind it isn't real, but the film utilizes every single penny of its shoestring budget to really make it feel real. Obviously, there's some pretty fantastic production design here, considering the small budget. Whether it be these formations in the trees, these little rock formations appearing all over the place, and even handprints on the walls, and these markings. It's really, really well done and really does create quite an eerie and unsettling vibe, especially when paired with the actual cinematography itself. This was shot on video cameras, which were then converted into film, and the sort of grainy, fuzzy look of it all is a very interesting one and really enhances that vibe, particularly when we actually see the sort of documentary stuff and they utilize black and white. It creates quite a striking and eerie effect, really enhancing this, unsettling vibe, especially with the squarish aspect ratio, really making it feel like, quite confined and claustrophobic, really making us and the characters feel trapped, which is quite impressive considering the, quite expansive, woodland setting. It really does a fantastic job of building that sense of unease and dread throughout. And obviously the story is built around, these characters making these quite misguided, reckless, stupid decisions. But what makes the story so interesting to watch is that, the entire thing is very much built around the consequences of this misguided, set of decisions. Obviously the core of it being, actually going into the woods and filming this documentary. Obviously, yes, the character decisions are stupid, don't get me wrong, but the story, does a good job of, very much framing it from a place of naivety rather than actual incompetence. And that's what makes it so interesting. More so than, the actual mysterious, spooky occurrences, what makes it feel quite, gripping and real is the actual close-knit character dynamics at the center of it all. That's where the real horror comes from. The sort of, sense of, desperation. These, fairly ill-equipped, inexperienced trio lost in the woods, desperate, afraid, angry. That is what makes it all so compelling to watch. Seeing them turn on each other, their anger and desperation giving way into fear. It's this is what makes it so just interesting to watch. And there are those little moments of humor that are sprinkled in throughout early on, with the little moments of bantering between the three. Obviously, yes, it does take a little bit to get going, but once obviously we get into the woods and the sort of true nature of why they're there reveals itself, it really is just, a very gripping ride to see unfold throughout. And, it's sold by a trio of, very, very good performances. Again, considering, these aren't like big name actors or anything, and this isn't a big production, the performances here are pretty stellar. Obviously, we have Heather Donahue as Heather, who, rather teary-eyed, admits that, this documentary they're making is all she has left. And, it's very interesting seeing that, plus the desperation of the terrible situation she finds herself in, really shaping her, increased sense of anxiety throughout. We also have Joshua Leonard as Josh, and Michael C. Williams as Mike. All three of them are great. They really sell the fear, the desperation, the anger of this, terrible situation, and just the sheer hopelessness of it. They really are fantastic, and it really makes their close-knit dynamic and the terrible stuff they see unfold around them just feel that bit more real, really selling that, that documentary found footage angle. It's very, very well done. And yeah, again, that is where the real horror comes from, not from these, eerie formations they see in the woods, but from, being, well-intentioned filmmakers finding themselves in the middle of a, terrible, incredibly desperate scenario, one that is very real, and I think many can relate to. And of course, it builds to a very, very gripping climax with a pretty hard-hitting and raw scene of Heather, talking to the camera and, very much letting all her admissions and guilt out, and a pretty tense and gripping climax in this abandoned house in the woods. Yeah, it is all very, very well done. And especially so given the micro budget. Overall, the Blair Witch Project is proof that you don't need a massive budget and a huge Hollywood crew to make an effective horror film. All you need is a simple, solid central idea and commitment to your vision to see it through. And yeah, it gets very, very effective scares out of that. Out of 10, the Blair Witch Project gets 8 pumpkins. Well, that's the pumpkin system retired for another year. Yeah, we'll see it again next year. So yeah, let me know down in the comments, have you seen the Blair Witch Project? What do you think of it? And let me know, what is your favourite of the found footage horror films that it ended up spawning? Let me know all that down in the comments. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you're new. And don't forget to turn on post notifications so you don't miss an upload.